No, it's okay. All right. So this has been covered by both Carolyn and Vinay pretty extensively, but this is really the crux of a lot of the issues, kind of where a lot of your research might be focused. So I'm going to be talking about stakeholders, so people who are invested in the issue, either because they'll be directly affected by the policy or sometimes indirectly, as we'll see. So clicking in. Okay, so one example is the public. And when I'm be talking about the different stakeholders, I'm going to be referencing a policy memo that I wrote. So it was one that Vinay touched on a little bit about cash bail. So that memo is specifically about a blinking on the word, a ballot measure that California residents could vote on about whether or not to eliminate cash bail. So cash bail is when someone has been arrested and they're waiting for trial. If they're deemed to be high risk, or if they can afford bail, then they can leave jail prior to their trial. But if they can't afford it or they're high risk, then they have to stay. So what this bill is proposing was to eliminate the cash requirement because a lot of people were just in pretrial detention because they couldn't afford to be otherwise. But what we said was a issue with the bill being proposed is that it was going to switch over the power to determine whether or not someone was high risk to algorithms, which are normally based on things like your neighborhood, your education, your income, past arrest records, and all those things are actually really, really biased. So even though people hear the word algorithm and they think that it has a magical answer, we thought that based on the data that was being fed on it, that the results would actually be very similar and be biasing the same people who couldn't afford bail. So anyways, so we had submitted this in maybe like February of 2020, and it was rejected by JSPG, and there were some issues that we worked out. But also when we resubmitted, it was around May 2020 when the BLM movement had become a lot more prominent in the day-to-day lives of people. And we think that we have no evidence of this, but we think that was part of the reason why they reconsidered our memo, was because this was just an issue that was being talked about a lot more. So that kind of plays into, even though you may have people who are directly affected, a lot of policies, who's paying attention. So that's a really good thing to know as well. So one thing is media. So when we were making our cash bail memo, we had to think of pros and cons for the different things we're proposing. And what we wanted was, we wanted cash bail to be eliminated, but we wanted to be done in a different way than was being proposed. And we wanted to happen soon. We were talking about the effects, the consequences of keeping cash bail around for a long time. And when we had to think about some of the cons that would happen, is that if you change it too fast, for example, if there was going to be a very statistically improbable event of someone who is out before pretrial committing a violent offense, that's the kind of thing that tends to get a lot of media coverage and take up a really disproportionate space in the voter's mind, even though it has proven to be a really infrequent event. So something like that, in his example, like the role that media might play in occupying voters' opinions on things, and maybe, you know, curving certain aspects of the issue one way or another. Another thing is business. So for example, with cash, I'm gonna stick to the cash bail example so we don't have to bounce around too much. But the reason that this was a ballot measure in the first place is that it was actually just a bill that didn't concern voters. It was just going through the legislature and it passed. But then the cash bail business, which is going to be affected by this, of course, it's a huge business. They came up with, they got a referendum. So they actually appealed a law that had passed and said we should put this up to the voters, put a ton of money into a campaign which was called, I have it in my notes, it was called Californians Against the Reckless Bail Scheme. No bias there whatsoever. And that's how it actually ended up in a ballot. So that's a really clear example when a business has a vested interest in the issue and how can even be, and really shifted the landscape, because now it was up to the voters, but before it was just purely up to the California legislature. Policymakers. So this has been talked about a lot, but one thing I'll say is that for the cash bail, something that we could draw on that I thought was really powerful is that we looked at other countries. So we've been talking a lot about like other municipalities or different states in the US and what policies they may have, but we could say that the US is the only country that has this cash bail system. And there was a really good contrast there in what had worked in other places versus what we had historically been doing from the beginning. And regulatory bodies, so we've been talking about something like the energy regulatory bodies. My memo on tear gas regulation was talking about FDA supervision, but another type of regulatory body that was relevant to us with cash bail were the judges, so the judicial system, and they actually have a final say on a lot of these issues, but there's not a whole lot of oversight there. So that was something that had made us really concerned about an algorithm, is that now it would be up to a machine and it'd be up to the judges. And we're able to look at the track record of a lot of judges when it came to whether or not they'd be waiving a cash bail. And we found that it varied hugely between judges and areas, and also tended to be biased towards certain statistics that would also be biasing the algorithm. So regulatory bodies. And then the last thing, so is there a consensus within the scientific community? That may not always be a thing, but often it is, and it just doesn't get out there. So for cash bail, this is not biological science, but the consensus among economists everywhere is that cash bail in the US just makes no sense. Like, it doesn't benefit people, doesn't benefit the government. It's only benefiting the cash bail industry. And they had been really unequivocal about that for a long time. And all the studies were out there, and all the statements would be made, but somehow it wasn't translating at all to policy, which was not like nice for us to see, because I think that like there's a lot of science that goes out there that like doesn't get paid attention to policy, and you always think of like economics as being the one that has a lot more weight. But it was really eye-opening for me to see that there had been this consensus in this field of study that I thought wielded so much more power than science. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. And then there's also something called power mapping, because all these things influence each other. None of these things exist on their own. And so that's where things get complicated, but really, really interesting, and a really effective way for you to pinpoint what to affect. Because ultimately, you're not going to be shaping a policy that's going to be affecting everyone. So you want to know who to target that's going to lead to the most effective change. So for example, the media may influence the public. The public is going to be the one who ends up voting in different officials of the government. Business is going to be lobbying to the government, so they get affected by that. Regulatory bodies sometimes regulate business, and then the government regulates those regulatory bodies. Perhaps the scientific community sometimes dictates whether or not those regulatory bodies should be existing, what information they're working with. But also, sometimes the message isn't clear. The effect that certain people are having isn't as straightforward as you think. So that's something to keep it. So like I had mentioned with the economic consensus on how cash bail was not an effective way of public safety measure. That was there, but it wasn't going anywhere. And then also whether or not there is even consensus from the community. So these are all things to take into account that make for a lot of really engaging research. And so we're going to do an example now. And I'm going to pass it over to Carolyn to run through this example, because she has some personal experience with this issue.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California, which is our last nuclear power plant. And I actually grew up in the neighborhood where the power plant still is. So basically it accounts for 8% of California energy generation right now. Removing it is going to be estimated to result in millions of tons of additional greenhouse gas emissions. So it really could be better for the environment if we kept it going. On the other hand, the worries are mostly like the seismic risk. It is on the coast, so if there were an earthquake, there could be like another nuclear disaster. People have called back to Chernobyl or Fukushima disasters. That being said, no one ever like talked about that or was scared about that in my hometown growing up, funny enough. But interestingly, at the end of the day, the decision came down to the actual energy company that is responsible for running the plants. And the ultimate reason is essentially because they don't want to invest the $1 billion into making it basically up to date to be earthquake safe, the power plant, and it just doesn't make physical sense for them. So despite the media coverage, despite it might be an interest of different parts of the government or different legislators. It ultimately is coming down to the company.
Yeah, so for this exercise, we were just going to ask people to pick one of the stakeholders and how it might influence the decision in California to be shutting down this last power plant. So this is like an example that Carolyn mentioned. So like, for example, media could be playing a role by, trying to get more grabby headlines and inciting memory of like really disastrous historic events just to be catchy. So that's one example. And then Carolyn had mentioned with the business, how their stakeholder is the fact that they would have to be investing a lot of money into making it earthquake proof. So yeah, so people pick like government and then like some sort of way that they'd be influencing the situation, regulatory body. That's exercise. So and then we're gonna count down.
For the public, yeah. So type your answer in and don't send it, and then give you a few more seconds. We'll count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and send in your answers. Yeah, so the public could be concerned about safety, and that could influence the media or the government to make decisions based on the public's view of things, even if that's not, based in scientific rigor or anything, right?
Yeah, so Allie, maybe if you feel comfortable, so there's a few different safety issues here. So one could be something that Carolyn mentioned, just living next to a nuclear power plant in general, or two, like the safety of being concerned of changes that may or may not happen in order to earthquake proof it, with increasing natural disasters. Or the third one can even be like the safety of your town, as we have like limited access to renewable resources and we start to see the effects of that. So that's also